want to say thank you very much for everyone for joining us today for our third session in our monthly conversation labs at the USC Race and Equity Center. My name is AJ Mata. My pronouns are he, him. And as a descriptor, I have long black curly hair that I've tied up in a ponytail today, and I'm wearing a Cardinal USC shirt. I was reminded by several folks to make sure that I say Cardinal instead of red because that is the actual color of USC. I will not be the only person on the webinar here today. We're going to also be joined by Brandy Junius from the USC Race and Equity Center and Dr. Sarah Teutont. They're going to engage in a fireside chat here in about 20 minutes. But first, I wanted to talk to you all about a few items as it relates to the Great Reshuffle. So to go ahead and get started, I wanted to first drop a poll for everyone to please take the time to answer for us. This poll will ask you why or what factors influence the Great Reshuffle that we have seen over the last few years since the COVID-19 pandemic started in March of 2020. So we'll give everyone a second to answer this poll for us, please. All right, maybe about another 15 seconds. All right, last chance to answer the poll. Okay, perfect. Thank you for all the answer that. Let's go ahead and take a look at the results now that came from the poll. And as you can see, it's a pretty wide split in terms of factors that you all think influence the Great Reshuffle. The options we had here were work and climate culture, salary and compensation, company commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, flexible work arrangements, and COVID-19. When in reality, each and every single one of these factors played some sort of influence in this Great Reshuffle that we have seen across the country since March of 2020. And the hope is we'll be able to talk about each and every one of these through the next hour that we're in this conversation together. So thank you so much to everyone who had the chance to respond to our poll. Now, if you saw some of the information that went out about this session before today, we mentioned that we were going to be talking about everybody's favorite company. And the company we're going to talk about is, whether from a positive standpoint or a negative standpoint, is a company that most people around the world have heard of. It's almost hard not to because of the big player they are in the space. And so before we dive into the case vignette about them, I'd like to show you a quick video specifically about what we're going to talk about today.
A historic vote in New York City. Yeah. Workers at an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island will unionize, a first in the U.S. in Amazon's 27 years.
Today, we made history.
Of the 4,800 ballots, more than 2,600 were in favor of joining the Amazon Labor Union, formed by current and former employees, led by Christian Smalls.
This movement, this is the catalyst of a revolution.
The company fired Smalls in 2020, citing safety issues, after he helped organize a walkout over what he says were insufficient COVID precautions.
What does this moment mean for you?
This moment means everything. This is justice for me and these workers. Said that it's impossible, but the odds are too big, and they all should definitely take a good look at what we did.
Amazon said it was disappointed with the outcome of the election in Staten Island, adding, "We believe having a direct relationship with the company is best for our employees." Last year, the vote to unionize at an Amazon warehouse in Alabama failed, but a redo was ordered, and the results, which are being counted this week, are still unclear. The pandemic fueled a labor movement at many big chains, with workers demanding more rights, stricter safety protocols, and better benefits.
I think we're going to see more and more union activity across the country. Workers do have the upper hand right now in demanding more from corporate America.
Amazon spent more than $4 million trying to prevent today's result, and now they're facing another union vote later this month at a warehouse not far from here.
When the details take precedence, the rest
Great, thank you. I think that video is a really good intro into what we're going to talk about here for the next few minutes. And I said beforehand that it's a company, everyone's favorite company, because whether it's a company that you love to hate or hate to love, Amazon has become very ingrained in our day-to-day lives, whether it be from their retail side or some of the other organizations that they have acquired over the last few years. So to get us started in the conversation today, we have a case vignette that we're going to drop in the chat for everyone to take a look at. I recommend either following along or just saving this later as a resource that you can use down the line whenever you have to reference anything as it relates to the Great Reshuffle. And so we'll go ahead and go through this. I'm not going to go through this word for word because I trust you all can reference this whenever you need it. But at a very high level, let's dig into a little bit more of the details behind the scenes of what that video just talked about. So as many of you know, Amazon is the largest e-commerce company in the United States. They started as a book selling company and have obviously expanded quite a bit more beyond that to become the retail giant that we all know today. Now, even before COVID-19, Amazon's labor practices had been under scrutiny, but that became even more evident during 2020, during the pandemic. And realistically, there was organizations or warehouses across Amazon that were facing very, very similar challenges, but many of them felt that they were without any options of what to do. And the reason for that is if you go back over 20 years in Amazon's history, there have been different teams within Amazon that have tried to unionize, and absolutely every single one of them have failed. And this isn't even just warehouses. These are other teams within the Amazon ecosystem that all felt that they deserve better rights, better benefits, and more protection. And each and every time they either lost in the voting or didn't even get to the point where they could vote because there was not enough support. A lot of this was driven with Amazon's relentless drive towards anti-union rhetoric. They had entire teams of consultants that they would bring in to help put messaging out of why unionizing was bad, and also highly train their managers to spot any type of union efforts and try and stamp them out before they had a chance to build any momentum. This was all going to Amazon's plan, where they were able to break in the profits and keep their frontline workers suppressed until COVID-19 hit. Like many of you on this webinar, I think a lot of us turned to online retailers during COVID-19. With many stores being shut down, we turned to companies like this to be able to deliver the essential goods and services that we needed to survive during one of the most unprecedented times that we have all lived through. From a financial standpoint, this was fantastic for Amazon. Their stock rose unprecedented numbers because of how much demand there was for their services. But on the flip side of that, the people that were most impacted at Amazon were their frontline workers in their warehouses that were forced to be able to fulfill this unprecedented demand of goods and services that Amazon had never seen before. One particular warehouse that was mentioned in the video was in Bessemer, Alabama. In the summer of 2020, this facility reached its breaking point in terms of the poor conditions that they were in, as well as the external factors around us that were going on across the world. If you recall, back in May of 2020, that is the first time that there was another call for racial equity across the country, and this happened because of the murder of George Floyd. The workers at the Bessemer warehouse facility makeup was 85% Black, and they felt on top of the injustices they were facing within the organization they worked with, they were also now getting compiled on top of the racial inequities that they had to live with every single day of their lives. This became one of the first facilities to again try and unionize at Amazon. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful, but it created so much awareness, so much attention that other facilities across the country started to take notice. And around the same time is when Chris Smalls and Derek Palmer in Staten Island also started to realize that they deserved more from their organization. In March of 2020, they staged a walkout in protest of poor working conditions during COVID-19, mainly around forcing workers to come in, even though there were people around them that had tested positive for COVID. Remember, this is before any vaccines and very early on in the pandemic. Chris Smalls was eventually fired because Amazon realized the power and the voice that he had within the warehouse in Staten Island, but he didn't let this stop him, and he continued to push for the rights of the workers at the Staten Island facility, and he established the Amazon Labor Union. Now, Chris Smalls had zero labor experience in his life, but he knew what was best for the people there and wanted to advocate for it, even though he was no longer an employee of Amazon. And the way that he did this mainly was through grassroots efforts. He would wait at the bus stops where many of these employees would go after work so they could get back home. During the winter months and the colder months, he would set up fires at these bus stops in order to help keep these employees warm. He would bring food with him out of his paid for out of his own pocket, in hopes to be able to just talk to the employees there and make them understand why unionizing was so important. And this was all against the millions and millions of dollars that Amazon was pouring into anti-union efforts. And in April 2022, all of this finally paid off, where the Staten Island facility, JFK 8, became the first ever facility within Amazon to unionize. Now, this was a historical moment, not only for Amazon, but really across the country, because it showed for the first time in a very, very long time, the power that workers have when they come together and unite with a common voice to create a systemic change that benefits the greater good. And since this happened, multiple other Amazon facilities have begun the process to go through unionizing, and other organizations across the US have also done the same. One that we showed in the video was Starbucks, has also had its first successful unionization in 2021, and 16 stores after that also unionized, with more on the way. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind when looking at this is there are a new generation of frontline workers coming in. A lot of these employees are millennials, a lot of them are Gen Z, and these two groups really gravitate towards more focus on mental health and equity and social impact, and they want to see that from their organizations, and they are willing to get together to push for these changes. And so as a result, this Great Reshuffle is forcing many organizations to reevaluate the ways in which they interact with their workforce and the diverse communities they serve. While this has led to positive changes for employees in some instances, it has also brought new challenges for organizational leaders. And so as we start to transition over to the next part of this conversation labs, there are three things I think it's important that you all keep in mind as it relates to this particular case on Amazon. One is the sleight of hand that organizations like Amazon tend to do, where they promote one positive thing about their organization while trying to hide some of the other unethical things. In Amazon's case, they are very vocal about their $15 an hour minimum wage, but they then choose to ignore some of the other unethical conditions in terms of bathroom breaks, the timing of employees, as well as some of the other conditions actually inside the warehouses or for the drivers. The second thing is organizations that try to justify their anti-union sentiments by stating they'd like to have a direct relationship with their employees rather than having the union come down the middle. If this was actually true, why would organizations such as Amazon spend millions of dollars to try and bust unions? And the third thing I think it's important for everyone to think about is what comes next after this? You know, what is next for the Great Reshuffle? As the economy starts to shift now, do employees still have that same power that they did coming out of COVID? What are the trends that both blue collar and white collar workers are going to advocate for as we move further away from the COVID-19 pandemic into this new reality of the working world? And in order to try and help us answer some of these questions, I'm going to introduce Brandy Junius and Dr. Sarah Teutont to talk a little bit more about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, AJ, and thank you for taking us through that case. My name is Brandy Junius. I am our Director of Corporate Partnerships here at the USC Race and Equity Center. I use she, her pronouns. For a visual description, my hair is up in a bun with some curly bangs. I have some large frame glasses, some silver earrings on, a pink floral dress, and a purple cardigan. I am so excited about today's conversation that I'll be having with Dr. Sarah Teutont, who I will allow to introduce herself in just a minute. She's such an expert in this space, and we're so thrilled to have her here. So Sarah, do you mind introducing yourself for us?
Sure. Thanks, Brandy. My name is Dr. Sarah Teutont. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at a statewide policy and advocacy agency, Child Care Resource Center, where we advocate for our families and communities, and we serve over 50,000 families and children every month. And, you know, prior to that, I'll also give my physical description. I'm in a black blazer. I have some glasses on, some long click-clacky acrylic nails here. My hair is back in a bun and wearing a light green shirt. I'm also in the office today. I go in once a week. So if you hear some commotion in the back, that's what that is. But prior to my time at CCRC, serving in a director role, I was at I did my PhD at USC in urban education policy, and have worked closely with the Race and Equity Center. So I'm very excited to, you know, talk about all these many important issues and hopefully get to some great conversation around this topic. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You talked a little bit about your background now, but just to kind of lay the groundwork for this conversation, can you share with us a little bit about how equity is at the core of your work and the ways that you support employees' journeys to have more equitable and inclusive workplaces, specifically in your current role and just generally in your experience?
Right. So, I mean, I'll first start off by saying, you know, the field of DE&I is not necessarily new. I think people have been doing DE&I work, but it hasn't necessarily been called that, right? So I've always tried to infuse equity in everything that I do. But in my current role as a Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, let's just be real, this is a brand new role, right? This is something that I think many organizations and companies are now hiring for, especially given, you know, the Great Reshuffle and what that has brought. So that being said, my organization was one of many that realized that we need specific professionals that address these topics. So as far as how I infuse equity and how I go around equity and why I prioritize it, it's not only because I think it's important, but I think it is necessary. Like, I don't think that where we are currently at in our society, we would be doing a disservice to our employees if we don't actually prioritize equity. And so this looks different, right? For everyone. We have our programming and our workshopping side, also like that policy side. We're looking at our hiring practices, our promotional procedures, our discrimination claims, our employee engagement, our opportunities for professional development. All those things are so necessary when thinking around about what equity means and how to ensure that. So, I also want to say that I think it is so important that you can't just have like a DEI director or chief diversity officer and call it a day, right? You have to equip them with funds so that they can actually do their work, and ample funds so they could, you know, or be sufficient funds so they can actually be successful, and a team. If you hire one person to do DE&I work, and not provide them a team of professionals, I don't think that's being equitable either. And I'm sure we'll get more into that, but I just wanted to note that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've heard that a lot, you know, doing work with different organizations and speaking with their chief diversity officer or their director of DEI. And one of the first things they say is, you know, I can only do so much as one person. If I don't have a budget for programming, for professional development, to bring in consultants, to bring in support, if I don't have a staff or team to support me, how serious is the organization really about progress in this area? Because especially for some of these organizations that have thousands and thousands of employees, you just listed all of these things that y'all are reviewing, and from complaints to employee engagement and all of these other things. How can one person ensure equity is dispersed across all of those spaces in an organization of thousands of employees, right? So I appreciate you making that note. I also want to touch on something you said a little bit earlier, and that for you, this is a new role in your organization. It's a new role, and we're seeing a lot of that as well. We're seeing a lot of organizations where this is the very first time they've ever had somebody dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not, you know, somebody's side job, or, hey, can you make sure we do celebrations on the history months or whatever, right? Like, it's somebody's full job. And I could imagine there's some challenges coming with being the first person in a role like this. Do you have a couple of tips for organizations to help, you know, ease that challenge in having just that inaugural role?
Right. I think, and obviously, you know, I face my own challenges as well, given that this is an inaugural role. But I will say the biggest tip, and I think something that my organization does well, is that before they hired me, right, they really looked at who did they want this person to report to. So it starts prior to even me getting here, or your director of DEI being here. You have to think about the structure. I report directly to our CEO. That means something, right? I think that when you have DEI situated in HR, it is a complete, for optic reasons, it's different, right? And also for, you know, just seeing how your organization really does prioritize DE&I. First things first, who does this person report to? That's number one, right? Number two, I'm not saying that you need to have a team coming in, but at least there need to be funds for this person to start hiring. So within the first 4 months of my role, I started interviewing, right? And now we've just hired 2 more people onto the DEI team, and that's going to continue to grow. So that's also another thing. Another tip is providing funds and access for this person to create a team and start building out. And another thing is realizing that, yes, DEI is a journey, and I'm sure we've all heard that. It's a journey, but we all meet people where they're at, but we don't want to stay there. So like that kind of rhetoric, I think, is a really big tip I can give too, is, you know, yes, it's a journey. Yes, we're meeting people where we're at, but like, what are our goals? And creating like a tangible timeline for, you know, for those types of goals. So for my organization and our strategic plan, we have goals that we want to meet by the end of 2023. And those are very specific goals that we've pulled from our data, right? And so that workshopping piece and that like holiday piece and celebration piece, great, love it, important to recognize employees and recognize the different cultures and places that people come from. But also what we want to see is, let's look at our hiring data. Let's look at our numbers. Let's look at things that we can improve in the future and hold ourselves accountable so that we can actually say, did we actually improve DEI, or did we just hire somebody to be performative, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those data-informed goals are everything. And I appreciate you sharing that with us, because I know that's a challenge a lot of organizations are facing. They're really thinking about, how do we make this role meaningful and not performative? And it's kind of hard to figure out when you've never done it before. So we definitely appreciate you sharing that. So we heard AJ a little bit earlier talk about the ways worker equity was not always centered, even when the organization was doing well. And we used examples like Amazon and Starbucks. And we heard him also talk about how COVID-19 and the racial uprisings in the summer of 2020 with the murder of George Floyd also had an impact on that. So I'm curious, Sarah, how have you seen the Great Reshuffle play out in your workplace or your experience with consulting or any other spaces where you do DEI work? And how has that phenomenon been impacted or informed by both COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd, the racial uprisings, this push for social justice we've really seen across our country?
Well, I mean, I could speak on a personal note, because I think that when I went on the job market after my PhD, I wasn't seeing, prior to me finishing my PhD, I wasn't seeing too many opportunities for DEI positions. But I think by the time all of the protests have happened because of the murder of George Floyd, by the time the pandemic was kind of I mean, we're still in a pandemic, but by the time things started to kind of open up, I was on the job search during that time. And I kid you not, I started to see, I had my LinkedIn alerts on, and I started to see so many DEI positions popping up and popping up and popping up. And so for me, I realized companies are seeing the importance of this, but it's still very much new. So I think that we're going to continue to see companies and organizations pushing for roles like this. So that's one change. And then an additional change is, like we talked about before, our millennial workers and our Gen Z workers, they're pushing for more, they're advocating for more, they want more out of their workplace. We spend so much of our time throughout our week at work, right? And I think that these younger generations are just pushing for not only work-life balance, but equitable benefits, a place where work doesn't feel draining, and also a place where work doesn't feel like it's their life. We're not designed to work for the rest of our lives, even though we live under capitalism. But I think that, you know, COVID-19, the murder of George Floyd, all of these two things in particular, coupled together, really made us realize we can work from home and things will still go on. Oh, we can not work 8 hours a day and maybe we finish a few hours earlier and still get our jobs done. I think what it did is it pushed for the idea of flexibility, and it pushed for the idea that we need to humanize each other in the workplace even more. I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. And that's such an important experience, whether we're talking about racial equity, whether we're talking about the unionization of workers, it's humanizing people who work for your organization. We're not machines, we're not robots, we're not people who come without needs to care for ourselves, that come without families or people we're responsible for or responsible to, right? And so pushing for a work environment now almost seems like wild that wasn't the standard before, like to be able to work from home and that's not looked at like you're being unproductive or lazy, that we completely understand that these are ways in which people can work successfully. And I think it is a big deal that this Great Reshuffle has really been characterized by putting a focus on humanizing people who are working for this organization. So I'm double clicking on that point that you made because, and also the other point that you made, you know, working under a capitalistic structure, kind of the idea is that we should always as an organization be looking to maximize profits. And even through that lens, if we think about worker productivity as a function of their wellness, it behooves companies to care about justice and equity and belonging and inclusion in the way that they operate, because that is going to lead to increased productivity. So I think both of those can exist simultaneously and benefit everyone. So I appreciate your comments on that. Taking note also of the differences among and between employee groups, what ways should organizations reevaluate the ways that they interact with Millennial and Gen Z workers to create more equitable experiences for them? And we say Millennial and Gen Z workers because we understand that these, like, kind of generally speaking, are the people who are pushing this forward, but we know that there are people in every age group that are pushing this forward, and obviously every employee deserves more equitable treatment. So I say it with that caveat, but what can organizations do to engage differently with their workers so that they can really provide a more equitable experience?
I think a couple things. I think number one, you know, you have to be, companies and organizations have to be open to listen to their employees, as well as being open to change. You know, I think there's a common saying, well, this is always how we've done things. And it's okay to change things and try things a different way. Another a thing is to give those Millennial and Gen Z workers opportunities. So I'm a Millennial. I'm our youngest director that we have here at my agency, and they acknowledge that. And I think that they knew that coming in, that they wanted somebody that kind of could speak to multiple generations and connect people across ages and across generations. But that took them taking an opportunity and taking a chance on me and being open to listening to the future of the workplace, right? Because Millennials and Gen Z are the future of the workplace. So I think that that kind of camaraderie and kind of solidarity across generations is definitely something that we need to acknowledge and get at. I also think another things that companies and organizations can do is really kind of survey or just talk to your employees and understand what the issues are and understand what's there and create a plan on how to move forward. I think that when you ask people what's going on and what are ways that we can improve, they will tell you, but it's up to leadership teams to listen.
Listening, yes. I think I don't know why that it's so powerful, but also so simple, right? Because we do a lot of surveying in the workplace. We do employee experience surveys, we do exit surveys, we do stay interviews, we do a lot of information gathering as a part of our processes, generally speaking, but what are we doing with that information and how are we taking that to heart? As a follow-up question to something you said, Sarah, you had mentioned you're the youngest director there at your organization. And like, first off, congratulations. Amazing. But also, do you think that that's a shift we'll see kind of across different organizations where we're getting in younger leadership to bring in fresh ideas? I mean, I think we have kind of this idea or this socialized stereotype that organizational leaders are seasoned with age and experience, but are we starting to see evaluation of different types of experiences? What do you think?
I would hope so. That's the goal, right? I hope that organizations and companies start to realize that you don't need 15 years of experience to thrive in a role. You need the skill sets and the competencies, right? But giving people opportunities, particularly younger leaders, opportunities, it's something that needs to happen. So I hope that people start to adopt the idea that it's important to give these types of opportunities. In my experience, I remember in my interview even talking about that and talking about, I was also trying to sell myself, but I was saying that, as a millennial, I'm able to speak to multiple generations of people. And I even remember talking around the fact that, no, I don't have 15 years of experience. I'm not that DEI professional that's going to have 10 plus years of experience because 10 years ago, I was, still figuring out what I was trying to do with my life. So, I will say that it was my leadership team who really took that and they sat with it and they said, let's try something new. Let's try something different. And I think that it ultimately is an example of how you can actually do equity work, is including those important voices in the conversation.
That's amazing. And so just to kind of expand on that a little bit, do you have any advice you can give younger employees who are really ambitious, really looking to be in a leadership role, that have the competencies, like you said, and the skill sets you said? What can they do? How can they bring their voice up into those spaces so that they are given those opportunities?
I have a few tips. Number one, apply to the job. Even if you don't think you have all the years of experience, apply. Just put your application out there and see what happens. Number two, really kind of write down your skill sets and competencies. Write all the things down that you think you've built up over the years, and incorporate that in your story, in your narrative. So when you are in interviews or you have your resume, that you can really speak to all the things that you've really done and the things you're capable of. An additional thing is understanding that this idea of, I guess, imposter syndrome. I know a lot of DEI professionals tie imposter syndrome back to whiteness, because and that's a whole different story. But for me, it's the best way that I can describe the feelings that I had coming in, feeling that, maybe I'm not ready or things like that. I'd say you got to nip that in the bud. You just got to let it go, because at the end of the day, nobody actually really knows what they're doing, regardless of the generation that you're in. We're all kind of figuring it out and going with the flow, and that's okay. And then I think that we need to extend ourselves grace when we're understanding that part of a job, regardless of your age, is it's going to take time to understand what that looks like. And so don't let that deter you from all the many opportunities that are out there.
And I think that's a great point, which you just made, right? Like the world that we live in today, I would say post-COVID, but we're still very much in COVID, but post the catastrophe that was initiated in 2020 with COVID and these social and racial uprisings. I mean, we're seeing push for women's rights even more so right now, on top of communities of color. And so I think, to your point, even seasoned leaders right now don't know what they're doing. They don't know what to do. We're all trying to figure it out. What is this new world of working from home or hybrid work, or, what does employee benefit in compensation packages? Like, what do those look like in 2022, where people are like, healthcare should be more robust, childcare should be on the front and center, like I should have flexible hours and all of these things. And so I think that does create a space for voices across generations to really step into the conversation and say, like, just because you've been with this organization for 20 years doesn't necessarily mean you know how to handle this situation. It's new for all of us. And I think it creates an amazing opportunity for new voices to be heard. So I definitely appreciate what you just shared there, because it is important to know exactly what value you bring to the table and to overcome imposter syndrome because you don't look like the person who's typically in this role. That doesn't have to be the standard in your mind or anyone else's. Last kind of big bucket question for you, Sarah, and I really appreciate your time today because you've given us such amazing insight as we've had this conversation. What advice do you have for organizational leaders to respond to the challenges associated with the Great Shuffle? How should they lift up or prioritize employees of diverse communities? And like when I'm talking about diverse communities, I'm talking about across the board, not just communities of color, but we're talking about women, we're talking about folks from the LGBTQIA plus community, other marginalized groups. What can organizational leaders do? And I know you had talked about listening earlier, but do you have any additional insight for us, any additional tips?
I think beyond the listening fact, because you can listen all day, every day, but if you don't actually take initiative to address the things in which you've heard, then the listening isn't going to be helpful, right? So I think number one, listen to what people need to address it. If that means that you need to hire somebody full-time to address these issues, make sure that you compensate them fairly, give them a team, give them a budget, so that they can address all of these things as it relates to DE&I. If you already have a DE&I person, make sure that you go look back and say, are we providing you with the resources in which you need to be successful, as well as employee resource groups, right? Some organizations and companies have employee resource groups, such as, an LGBTQ employee resource group, or a Black employee resource group, or working parents employee resource groups. If you don't have employee resource groups, that's a great way to create a sense of belonging amongst your company or organization. But even beyond that, compensate those employees for their time, for leading those efforts, as well as give those employee resource groups a budget so that they can actually host programs and push for change and give them a voice. So I think that overall, my biggest piece of advice for leaders is, give people a voice, but put your money behind that voice, right? Because at the end of the day, we need resources to really advance the many things that we want to. So overall, I think that's kind of what I would say to that.
Thank you, Sarah. And you're making me think as we're talking a little bit too. Two questions actually. One, what's the biggest social justice, social impact related change you've seen as a result of the Great Reshuffle, whether within your organization or outside of it? And where do you think this will continue to go as workers are seeing, and we had talked about this earlier with AJ's case vignette, as workers are seeing that they have power, when they're seeing that they actually have position and negotiate, whether it's through being a part of a union or just having that leverage of understanding, if we all walk out, this company isn't going to be able to continue to function. So, kind of seeing the impacts of their collective power, where do you think we will continue to see this movement going into 2023, coming out of COVID? Looking at changes in policies and so forth.
I think we're going to see it continue. I think this is just the beginning. I think that, we're going to see changes, and I hope to see that we're going to see changes in benefits, changes in the prioritizing of employees' mental health. I think we're going to see changes in the workforce as well, with different generations getting in different types in higher leadership positions and having a seat at the table and having a voice at the table as well. I think that 5 years from now, I really hope that we're going to see significant changes in the policies in which we implement, but most importantly, a culture shift. I think that we're going to see a difference in how we define what work means for all of us, regardless of your generation. Because as I mentioned before, we are not built to have work as our complete identities. Many of us have families or friends or identities outside of the workplace that are just as important. And I think that those things should also be we should encourage to bring our full selves into the workplace, right? We're human beings at the end of the day. So I'm hoping that the Great Reshuffle is going to help us continue to remember that it is, at the end of the day, it is important to humanize each other.
I love that. And I love that you brought it back to the humanization. Mental health and wellness, I think, is also a growing topic, particularly in DEI spaces, because if we're not thinking about the experiences of workers in terms of how it impacts their well-being, and we're just looking at it in terms of productivity, we're going to see burnout, we're going to see people just not be able, we're living through collective trauma when we're talking about a global pandemic, when we're talking about seeing and experiencing and witnessing injustice across difference. That's a traumatic experience, and to continue to expect people to just push through it in the name of productivity, I think is a little naive at this point. So you're absolutely right. And you had talked about this shift towards real equity. So I'm curious, as employees are considering new opportunities, what are some markers of equity they should be looking for in their potential new workplace? What should be green flags to workers that this is a good space for equity for me?
A green flag, and a question I always encourage people to ask when they're on the job market is, what is your title? What is your role? And how long have you been with the organization? Or how many titles have you held? And I think that helps kind of look at promotion practices, right? So if someone's only held one title in the span of 5-6 years, that might tell you something about their promotional practices. So that might be a red flag, but a green flag might be multiple titles, right? Another green flag might be employee resource groups or other opportunities for professional development, or some way to actually get involved, because that means that that your organization is at least committed to creating some sense of belonging. Another one, obviously, are benefits, and looking at the diverse benefits that an organization might have. In addition, a question I always like to ask is, are employees encouraged to bring their full selves to the workplace? Because that's going to show you kind of that work-life balance, and whether or not that organization is going to allow you to, again, be a human being. And I think that we're actually shifting into a place where people that are being interviewed are now interviewing the people they're being interviewed by, right? It's a two-step process. So I think we're seeing a power dynamic shift in the ways that interviewing has typically worked, because there's quite a bit to consider when you're thinking about, joining a new organization, and what does that environment look like in terms of equity. A last green flag I would say is if they have a DE&I office, and what are some of the initiatives and programs that they have actually done? Because it's one thing to have somebody, but what are the things that they're actively working on?
And those are great tips. And I also want to double click on what you said in terms of you're interviewing the interviewer as well, right? And I've heard a lot of millennial workers, and I am an older millennial, so I feel like I'm part of that, but I'm still coming out of some of the ways I was socialized to view interviews in the workplace. And so this is also innovative for me when I'm hearing these things, but hearing people say, ask them about their DEI goals and strategies. Ask them, do they have anybody at their organization who's in charge of DEI? Ask them about their journey to be more equitable. Ask them how they've worked to correct their historical inequities if they're a company that's existed for a while, because we understand that all of these companies who have been here for a while have participated in some form of harm, intentional or not, to marginalized communities, just based on the way that our workforce has been structured historically and stuff. So I think it is really important to give people that power and encourage them to say, like, whatever is important to you, what is your corporate social responsibility and corporate social impact initiatives that you're working towards? Like, ask those questions, make sure that there's alignment, because if you're a highly skilled, highly talented employee, you're going to have multiple places you can go for employment. And the place you're going to be most happy is the place that aligns with your values, the place that supports you in that way. So I think those are great pieces of advice. Let me take a look at the time. We have about 10 minutes. I want to ask you one more question, and then maybe we'll move into some Q&A and hear from the audience. What practices should organizations encourage to promote equity in the workplace, especially as it pertains to attracting and retaining employees from diverse communities in light of the Great Reshuffle?
I think we talked about this a little bit, but one practice is looking at what partnerships do you have with external places or organizations, or higher education institutions to attract diverse talent, right? What type of things is your HR team and your recruiters implementing so that they are, showing off their job opportunities to diverse candidates? One of the ways that we do this at my organization is we have a list of all of the partnerships, whether they be community partnerships or partnerships with our local colleges and universities around, making sure that those diverse populations know that there are opportunities for employment here. And so that's on that kind of like recruiting side and hiring practice. Another hiring thing that we like to do is ask the question in interviews, how are you committed to DE&I? And you kind of weed out those candidates who may not align with your DE&I goals, but most importantly, in terms of creating equitable spaces for future candidates and employees that are already from racially minoritized backgrounds, is being able to have those conversations in the workplace and not be so hush-hush around talking about race, talking about gender, talking about all these many different identities that we share, and encouraging a workplace that is equitable in the types of conversations that we have. And then I think lastly, and I'm pretty sure you can notice because I've mentioned it twice already, employee resource groups are very important. We are creating ours. Even if you don't have employee resource groups, programs, workshops, opportunities for racially minoritized people and their co-conspirators to connect, to feel seen, to have conversations around these topics, celebrate all the many different people that we have. There's monthly celebrations that we do to make sure that our diverse populations feel uplifted and seen. We have a large Armenian population in my organization. So for the first time, we celebrated Armenian Heritage Month, and as well as recognized Armenian Genocide Day. So looking at the demographics of your organization already and seeing what are ways that we can not only acknowledge, but uplift those folks that we have here.
I think that's really important. And one thing that I'm thinking about that we regularly coach organizations on too is building equity as a competency in your employee evaluations. If I'm a supervisor and there's no part of my evaluation of my job that reflects my ability to lead or foster or cultivate diverse teams, equity, inclusion, belonging on my team, that might not be something I focus on, even if it's a personal value of mine. If I don't see that the organization values those things and what they're expecting of me and my role, I might not prioritize it the same. I might prioritize whatever sales goals or metrics or whatever other things I'm being measured against for in terms of my success in my role. And so I think that's another thing to add to the list as well.
And I think another thing I forgot to mention is that, you know, organizations can really start to look at empowering their leadership team. So your directors, your managers, the people that are really, leading teams, do they feel comfortable? Do they feel empowered? Do they have the resources to even, address equity? Because I think that people care, but from what I've heard in some of my work, either consulting or in my current role, is, hey, as a director, as a manager, supervising folks, I care about equity, but I was never taught how to facilitate these conversations with a team. I don't know what I'm doing, right? So providing learning opportunities for upper management and for leadership teams. So that can look like hiring consultants or, so that there can be an opportunity to learn. Because like I said, sometimes it's really not that people don't prioritize or care. They just don't have the opportunity for education.
Absolutely. And I think that's important, especially if you have a small DEI team. That DEI person can't come in and have every single one of those conversations on behalf of, your people leaders. They have to be an impact multiplier in the ways that they bring in education or train or consulting, trainers or consultants to come in and really coach those directors or people in different leadership positions so that they can do the work for themselves on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. We have about 6 minutes left. I want to bring AJ back and see if we have some questions either in the chat or in Q&A that we can answer for anybody.
Yes, thank you. So we have a couple of questions that we'll try to get to in the last few minutes that we have. So one of them that has come up is, what can organizations learn from the Great Reshuffle that sets them up for future success? And I think, as I think about this, I think there's a lens that needs to be put on this, where we touched about it a little bit earlier, that the market and the economy is shifting from where it was a few years ago when a lot of this reshuffle started, where inflation is increasing, there's fears and worries with interest rates going up that we may be entering a recession. Do you think that frontline workers and employees still have that same level of power, and how do organizations kind of work through that as we kind of get into this new realm of the economy?
I think that employees do have that power. I think that what's difficult is, and something that I've seen in my work is that there is a level of exhaustion when you have your job responsibilities as well as advocating for future policies and initiatives that are equitable. Employees, I think the biggest issue is that employees will get exhausted. And so the best thing that I think organizations can do is provide support, right? So provide support for these types of issues to be acknowledged and talked about, because, I don't think it's sustainable. And I think that's the only challenge that we're really looking at. I don't think that it's sustainable for employees to constantly advocate, because people will experience burnout. Because like I said before, people are human beings. So I think the biggest thing that we can do, like I said, is provide support in a timely manner.
And just to add to that a little bit, and I will always be the person who advocates for wellness and mental health and support in that way, not waiting until somebody brings something up as a problem to offer those resources, making them clear, making them present, making them accessible, so that people can use them, not just in a moment of crisis, but on an ongoing basis, having that support on an ongoing basis. You don't get to the point of burnout. You don't get to the point of exhaustion. Try to, manage it on the front end. So do we have another question?
Yeah, actually, Brent, just to kind of follow up on that, I think this might be a good way to round us out and wrap this up, is I want to double click a bit more on that wellness piece, because I know it's something in our work that we've been working on quite a bit more lately. And going back to the idea of Gen Z and millennial employees, specifically looking for more from the organizations, that idea of wellness and really trying to make sure that we're taking care of those that are impacted by these things that are going on in the organizations. Can you just talk a little bit more about some of the resources that you think should be made available at organizations as it relates to wellness, and just really talk a bit more about why that's being asked for so much more from newer employees?
Sure. Sarah, do you want to weigh in on this at all before I kind of jump in there?
I want you to go ahead and jump in, because I know that you have quite a bit of experience when it comes to this. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think, and this is an interesting thing to say, but I think we're the generation of therapy, right? Like, therapy is not stigmatized in our generation in the ways that it was in previous generations. A lot of us look at having a mental health professional available to us as a way of improving and thriving in terms of mental health, and not just something that you look for when you're going through a major life crisis or a major life event has happened. So one is looking at mental health coverage that's available through your organization. I know a lot of folks look for therapists or mental health professionals who align with them in some way, whether it's their identity, their racial identity, gender identity, sexual orientation identity. And so having, and I've seen this play out in different ways, so I'll speak to it quickly, is, some providers aren't covered because they're not your in-network providers. And so organizations have to really look at their policies around mental health coverage and, rules around in-network providers, because if I specifically want a certain type of therapist, but that therapist isn't in my network, and so now my job doesn't cover that, are they really concerned with my mental health and my wellness in the ways that they should be? I also think company initiatives that provide wellness support are important. And so in the same way that you have ERGs that are around your identity, you may have a wellness ERG. That's not something a lot of organizations are doing right now, but I think that there's a lot of power and impact. In the same way your Black Employee Network can make sure that the organization is recognizing Black History Month and Juneteenth and these different things, your wellness ERG might be making sure that we're recognizing, different mental health months and creating activities and spaces for folks to do, whether it's yoga or mindfulness or any of these other things. They can be bringing those types of activities to the organization as well. And just bringing, the idea of wellness and mental health check-ins to whether they're coaching conversations or, you're meeting with your supervisor. I think that just to bring back to what you were saying, Sarah, that humanization, to check in on people and not just ask how their work's going, not just asking how they're progressing towards their goals or their, targets, but how are you doing emotionally? What support do you need? What resources do you need? There are a lot of social determinants of health that, all are interwoven with each other. And so if I'm struggling at work, it might not be because work is hard. It might be because I have a healthcare issue or a childcare issue or something else. And so just bringing mindfulness of wellness and mental health to the forefront as we're looking at creating spaces of inclusion and belonging and equity is something that's going to be important. I hope I answered that question. Okay. Cool. So I am looking at the time and it is 10:31. So I think it's probably about time for us to wrap up. Sarah, thank you so much for joining our conversation today. It was so great to have this chat with you, tap into your insight, and really just get the benefit of your experience and knowledge, which was so amazing today. AJ, thank you for the information you provided at the front of this session, which was really insightful as well. And I don't know, does anyone have anything else to say before we close out?
Good. Just again, thank you everyone for continuing to support these series. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, with that, I will say thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you next time. We're doing the first Wednesday of every month at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. And so we hope to see you next month.